the place that I live in and what people are doing to make the place a place that works in the 21st century. My name's Chris Smith. I've got a slideshow, which I assume they'll bring up when they have it. I run an organization called the Vernacular Music Center at Texas Tech University. The Vernacular Music Center is dedicated to learning, teaching, and passing on vernacular music. Now, when I say vernacular music, what I mean is a music that's learned and taught and passed on by ear and in the memory. You could back up to the first slide in that presentation, if you would, please. My presentation is entitled The Homeland of the Mind, and it's about the way that people learn things. There are lots of different ways of learning, and those ways of learning don't replace one another, they're complementary. I mostly deal with the world of vernacular performance, music, language, storytelling, dance that's learned and taught and passed on using demonstration, imitation, and critique rather than book knowledge. I do have to make a disclaimer. I'm speaking from my own experience. I was trained as a working musician and storyteller long before I ever became a university professor. So my experience, like all of our experiences, is unique. But there are certain things that result from my experience that I have brought back to my university teaching, which I think reveal deeper and valuable truths. The Vernacular Music Center, as I said, is headquartered at Texas Tech University, and we're involved in both research as well as teaching and advocacy. That means we research vernacular traditions, we also teach them in ensembles and classes, and we also serve as advocates. That is, we are advocates for the value of vernacular arts in building and rebuilding communities. My own feeling is that participating in making art is a basic human right. It is as essential to healthy human communities as clean air and clean water and freedom from fear and freedom from want. And the denial of the capacity to make art, the denial of the opportunity to make art, in my view, is a violation of human rights. And so that's where we come in. It's one of the places we come in. That's what I mean by vernacular. Learned and taught and passed on by ear and in the memory, by demonstration, observation, imitation, and critique. For example, it's how people learn blacksmithing. You don't read that out of a book. You still apprentice to learn to be a blacksmith. It's how people learn horseback riding, or I guess we could say how they learn dressage. It's how I learned to knead bread. It's also how I learned to pull lobster pots. It's also how people learn to make music. You may study things out of a book, you may sight read music out of a score, but at some point your teacher puts her or his hands on you and says, no, it should feel like this. And that learning, that body learning, is a very deep learning, and it goes back a very long way. The fundamental message of the kind of teaching that I have done, the kinds of things that I have done as a practitioner first and then a university professor, is to trust one's own performance skills. As a teacher, you're a performer. As a learner, you're subjected to a performance, and you just hope that it's a good one. If it's an effective performance, it probably is going to have some of the same riveting characteristics that any performance does. A good lecture should tell as much of a story as a great piece of narrative, as a great novel, or as a great poem. So, for example, when I teach, I think about where I'm teaching and what I'm teaching. And I try to find ways to manifest in my own conduct the kinds of behaviors that I'm looking for from students, whether that's inside the classroom or outside the classroom. One key insight that I have learned over many years, probably 40 years of working with vernacular art forms, is that there are certain kinds of parallels to how people in what we could call pre-literate cultures learn, cultures that primarily don't use writing, and also what a term which I'm afraid I might have coined, how people in post-literate cultures work. I know we have some teachers in the room, and I know that one thing that university professors often talk about is the fact students don't do critical reading, quote unquote, anymore. I never thought I would say that kind of thing when I heard my own professors say it, and yet I find myself saying it. One of my fundamental insights, though, one of the things that I learned about that kind of thinking is to recognize that some of the things that work in pre-literate cultures, cultures that are primarily oral and oral listening and speaking cultures, also work for post-literate communities. That is, students who mostly no longer receive information via text can actually learn via demonstration, imitation, and critique. And I'm going to unpack that a little bit and talk about some of the ways that a 21st century student population is a kind of post-literate population. As an example, I want to share with you a short piece of music. This is from a song, an English folk song, called John Barleycorn. Now, on the surface, it's a fairly stark tale of this poor man called John Barleycorn, who first grows and then is cut down and then is beaten with sticks and then is transformed and then rises again. It's this sort of death and rebirth metaphor. Well, it starts out like this. There were 3 men come out of the west, their fortunes for to try, And these three men made a solemn oath, John Barleycorn must die. They've plowed, they've sowed, they've harrowed him in, threw clods upon his head. And these three men made a solemn oath, John Barleycorn was dead. It's a very stark tale, yeah? In fact, it's an elaborate poetic metaphor about planting hops and making beer. Now, that's a kind of vernacular knowledge, right? It's a knowledge that's learned and taught and passed on by demonstration and imitation, and if you're lucky, a lot of experiment. And the song ends, and little Sir John and the nut brown bowl, and his brandy in the glass. And little Sir John and the nut brown bowl proved the strongest man at last. The huntsman, he can't hunt the fox, oh, so proudly to blow his horn. And the tinker, he can't mend kettle nor pots without a little barley corn, right? It's a lovely song. It's very, very, very memorable. It's much more memorable because it's rhymed and it's carried in a melody. And it was always carried not only in rhyme and in melody, but in the memory. Memories are important. And the loss of memories is a cultural loss as well. It's a cultural treasure, and it can erode and disappear. And if it does, you might forget how to make beer. So one key insight that I learned in working outside the classroom in the world of performance, vernacular performance, in midnight pub sessions, in juke joints in the Mississippi Delta, in little tiny country pubs in the west of Ireland, playing in coffee houses in Smyrna and Piraeus, in Turkey and in Greece. One of the things that I learned is that insights about learning and teaching outside the classroom can actually come back into the classroom, largely and especially because the body links them. You're out there in the world learning to do things in your body. You bring them back into the classroom and you try to find ways to embody those insights for students or for learners. One intuition that I've discovered through having learned a lot of different musics over the world, usually by being the least skilled musician on the bandstand, right? I was the guy in the back who played least well, and all of the guys up front are like, okay, well, there's that white boy. I guess we're going to have to show him how to do this, right? One of the things that I learned was to trust vernacular pedagogies. Any tradition, storytelling, language, music, dance, any tradition, making beer, any tradition that survives develops its own pedagogies. It develops its own ways of learning and teaching and passing on and preserving precisely the skills that that tradition thinks are important. They may be different than the skills required in another tradition. The tradition of classical music, I know we have some classical musicians in the house, expects that you will be highly skilled at reading notations from scores and at executing what you see thereon. In other traditions, that's not important. And so in those other traditions, their pedagogies emphasize different kinds of skills. Trust the vernacular pedagogies. Every tradition, by definition, every tradition that survives has one. Because if it doesn't have a pedagogy that works, it doesn't last, does it? Somehow people have to learn it. Here's another example. The image there on the upper left is an image of a man named Pádraig O'Keeffe, who was the last of the wandering Irish fiddle teachers. He walked from town to town, teaching tunes to people for a shilling a tune. And on the left are two of his students, including a man called Dennis the Weaver Murphy, playing the fiddle. Pádraig O'Keeffe is dancing to his students playing. And down there below on the right, for those of you who are classical musicians, you'll recognize that's actually a piece of music staff paper. But it does not contain notes. It contains actually diagrams of where the fingers go on the neck of the fiddle. It's called the Sliabh Luachra fiddle tablature. If you're a guitar player, you know tablature doesn't tell you what the notes are, it tells you where to put your fingers. But those patterns and where they're found on the fingerboard are precisely the information that Pádraig O'Keeffe wanted his students to retain. He didn't need to write down how the tune went because they learned the tune in the ear first, yeah? The tradition evolves its own pedagogy, and that pedagogy and the literature that carries it is quite precise, and it's a mistake to presume otherwise. So one of the intuitions I took away from learning these different performance traditions around the world is I should pay attention to their literatures. I should get the literature right. I should maybe think about developing the art of the memory, a largely lost art in a post-literate word, right? We write things down so we don't have to remember them anymore. But there was a time in which, in many cultures, if you were going to retain information at all, you had to remember it. And the people who had that skill, the people who had the ability to learn and memorize and recall, became quite respected, if sometimes quite feared, people in their worlds. Here's another example of the kind of thing that I mean. This is a song called the Shan Van Voght, and it commemorates a time in 1798 when a French fleet attempted to invade Ireland to facilitate an Irish rebellion against the English crown. And the image there on the left is a somewhat metaphorical or fanciful image of what actually happened to that French fleet, who were trapped by a storm and mostly drowned. The song is called the Shan Van Voght, and Shan Van Voght in Irish means literally the poor old woman. The Shan Van Voght in Irish literature is a poor old woman who personifies Ireland in her troubles, yeah? So the Shan Van Voght, this is a metaphorical figure, again, like John Barleycorn. And the song was written in the period, and it was intended to tell people that this event was going forth and that the time for the rebellion had come. And it goes like this. Oh, the French are on the sea, says the Shan Van Voght. Oh, the French are on the bay, says the Shan Van Voght. Oh, the French are on the bay, they'll be here without delay, and the orange will decay, says the Shan Van Voght. And the orange will decay, says the Shan Van Voght. And it goes on for many verses, and there's this recurrent refrain of the Shan Van Voght, yeah? It's quite memorable and quite repetitive. And it's more memorable and more repetitive because it has a tune. And that tune, I will just tell you, is what we musicians call an earworm. Once you've learned that melody, it's very hard to let go of it, which means it does exactly what it's supposed to do. And the orange will decay, says the Shan Van Voght. The orange was the orange of William of Orange, the then King of England. And the song is talking about booting the English orange out of Ireland in favor of the green of Erin. It didn't work, unfortunately. Another insight that I've taken away from studying a lot of musical traditions, a lot of storytelling traditions, literary traditions, oral literature traditions from around the world, is that those traditions very often have relevance beyond their original context. That is, there are things that these traditions can still teach us. Maybe they can teach us history, maybe they can teach us ethics, maybe they can teach us how to make beer. But those traditions developed the way they did because they work. And because of that, they tend to have a quite long shelf life. These things are memorable, those tunes are memorable, the recipe for making beer remains the same. Those traditions may have things to teach us, particularly in our 21st century, post-industrial, post-literate world. So, here's one premise. If I can get my slideshow back, I could use some help here. Good. One premise, thank you very much. That was magical. Absolutely magical. She just walked toward it and it was fixed. Magical. One premise that I took away is that in teaching, you sometimes have to make a decision between teaching more about data or more about process. But process tends to elicit a very different bodily reaction than data. And so sometimes you need to involve the body, and the body in learning, the body singing, the body standing, the body moving, the body dancing. It yields a very different kind of insight and a very different kind of retention than a teaching method that focuses upon a sort of bucket full of data. For example, you don't learn a perfect jump shot by reading about it. You may not be able to learn everything you need to know to make a perfect jump shot in the last 2 seconds of the 7th game of an NBA championship. You may not even be able to learn it just by watching it. You have to watch somebody do it. And then you have to imitate someone doing it. And you have to do it wrong a whole bunch of times. As your teacher, if you have a good teacher, says, no, not quite, try that. No, not quite that. No, not try that, not try that, not try that. And then if you're lucky, if you're more skilled than I, at one certain moment you let that shot go, and before it's ever even reached the top of its arc, you can turn, as that man did, at that moment in that basketball game, the last basketball game of his career, you can let that shot go and turn and start up the court because you know behind you, by the way the ball left your hand, by the way your body felt, that was a winning, nothing but net basket, right? Michael Jordan didn't learn that by reading about it. He shot 10,000 jump shots that didn't work. And on the 10,000th and first jump shot, it was nothing but net. And typically, when you have that kind of eureka moment, you go, God, that was beautiful. What did I do? Yeah? What you learn is how it feels when it's right, how it feels in the body when it's right, how the dance feels, how the song feels, how the teaching feels, how the preaching feels, how the jump shot feels, right? Integrating the body into the process of learning. Now, we live in a post-literate world. right? Most of the students that we deal with, formally or informally, whether you're a student or a teacher, whether you're in the classroom or out in the world, whether you're running a corporation and teaching people how to operate, or you're trying to enter a corporation and learn how to operate, mostly you actually learn in this kind of pre-literate way. You watch people do stuff, and you imitate how they do it. And you do it wrong a lot until one day you get it right and you say, my God, that was perfect. What did I do? Yes? It's how young people in the current generation learn to operate a Facebook app. It's how you learn to operate, if you come from those generations, how you learn to operate a new smartphone, yeah? You watch somebody do it, and you imitate it, and then you learn how it feels when it feels right. And that body knowledge is deep, and ancient, and current, and it is ever renewed every time you do it right the next time. I've got a friend who's a plumber. Yeah? He and I both used to work in the building trades. I was a framing carpenter, and he was a plumber, and he still keeps up his journeyman license. In fact, even though he runs a multi-million-dollar building on the campus, he's got his journeyman license sitting right next to the toilet in the staff bathroom, just to remind him of his roots as a plumber. And when I was talking to my friend Steve about it, and he said, oh yeah, we have that in the trades that I worked in too. He said, we used to call it read one, see one, do one. You read how to braze a weld, and then you see somebody do it, and then you do it. And usually the first 10 or 12 times you do that, you do it wrong, and somebody yells at you, and you learn, okay, I'll do it again, yeah? That's how I learned to knead bread, right? My mother taught me to knead bread. I don't even remember learning to knead bread. I just know that at some point I didn't learn it by reading about it. I learned it by watching someone do it. It's how I learned to build a spiral staircase. Anybody who's ever worked in the building trades will tell you that for a carpenter, a spiral staircase is the hardest thing in the world that you commonly have to do on a job site. I had to do them wrong a lot of times and get cussed out by master carpenters before I learned how it felt when it was right. Read one, see one, do one. One of our students' great strengths is their ability to recognize patterns. That's how they learn most things. In an internet age, and what do they call it, an always online age, always online generation, right? That's typically how people learn. They watch how things happen, they observe things. What do they do first? They go to the Google, that's the first thing they do. And they observe the patterns of what emerges. So one of their strengths is actually what we in scholarship call iconography. Here's an example of a piece of iconography. Some of you may know it. It's by a famous late 18th century caricaturist called James Gillray, who in the fashion of the time drew absolutely biting cartoons, very riddled with what we would now call politically incorrect caricature. This is entitled Farmer Giles and His Wife Showing Off Their Daughter Betty to Their Neighbors on Her Return from School. And on the left we see Farmer Giles and his wife who don't really fit their brand new clothes very well, and their daughter Betty who doesn't fit her brand new expensive dress very well. But by gosh, she is sitting there showing off her newly acquired piano skills to a person there on the far right who potentially represents a very important social step for her family. That's a potential suitor. And one of the ways you can tell that he's a potential suitor is because he's dressed better than everyone else. Secondly, because he's sitting in a rather withdrawn fashion. And thirdly, if you observe his profile, he has a really brutally receding forehead and chin, which is James Gillray's way of telling us this man is part of that inbred upper class. That's why he has this odd physiognomy, because everyone knows that the British upper class have receding chins and hairlines, just like everyone knows that the inbred Romanovs had hemophilia, yeah? So what Gillray is really telling us here is this is new rich money trying to marry their daughter upward. How? By showing off that she has the attributes, including the musical attributes, of a gentlewoman. Yeah? Now, that image is an image that I use in my own teaching, and students love these kinds of images. They have no familiarity with these kinds of social organizations unless maybe they've read the novels of Charlotte and Emily Bronte or Jane Austen, right, where these kinds of things figure. And yet, they come up with endlessly fascinating, and very detailed exegeses of these images. My students, I observe, relate very well to things that make use of visual patterns, like iconography. Text, on the other hand, text they study with. We are charged by the state of Texas to teach critical writing, critical reading, critical speaking, and critical thinking. And by gosh, they struggle. They struggle with any kind of a text-based model, anything that requires that they read two documents and synthesize the insights from those two documents. And so we have to remediate. We have to not only play to their strengths, we also have to try to remediate their handicaps. But it's very important for us as teachers to recognize what those strengths are, because we can maybe move toward accommodating, incorporating, expanding our arsenal of pedagogical methods by recognizing those pre-literate skills. Their ability to recognize patterns is remarkable. They can't find them in text, but by gosh, they can find them in visceral and intuitive ways. Boy, they can. So contemplative learning, experiential learning, project-based learning, these are all buzzwords that appear a lot in education now. Really, and I think it's very good that they do, really what they're talking about is learning with the whole body. Learning, in other words, in a vernacular fashion. One of the most powerful vernacular tools of all, one of the tools that was recognized in many different cultures since long before the unknown poets and the Mahabharata in India, long before the written texts that we know as the Iliad and the Odyssey, one of the most powerful teaching tools in pre-literate cultures is narrative. Once upon a time, let me tell you a story. Narratives have been powerful for 40,000 years. Ever since the cave paintings under Lascaux in France, people have been telling stories in an attempt to make sense of their world and their place in the cosmos. Stories are powerful, and we should use them. Patterns are powerful. Don't do this, do that. Try this, now try that. Memory. The art of memory is really, in my observation, is much neglected. Certainly it's much neglected in my own life. That's why I have a laptop computer, yes? However, knowledge that is internalized and carried in the memory operates, is preserved, and is accessed in different parts of the brain. The cognition specialists tell us that. Knowledge that is memorized, certainly music that is memorized and then performed from memory, is a very different cognitive experience, and I would argue a very different expressive experience as well. So we might think about memory, orality, recall, and the training, or at least the recovery of some of those tools. We could also extend those uses. Those are 4 images from 4 different, what we would call STEM disciplines, right? Science, technology, education, and mathematics, right? STEM disciplines. Those are 4 images from architecture, from radiology, from chemistry, and from meteorological firefighting, all of which we think of as very much hard science, data-driven fields. And every single one of them requires essential demonstration and imitation learning. That's how you learn to draw an architectural draft. That's how you learn to read an X-ray. It's darn sure, and I can tell you this by experience, how you learn to fight a forest fire. Yeah? These are still valid methods. We have a tendency to lose them because we live in a world which is largely object-oriented around passive consumption. I am suggesting a mode of learning and indeed a mode of experience that is oriented around process and active participation. And the reason I believe that this is important is because I believe these patterns and their power have things to teach us, even in our 21st century world, even in a world in which we think that all the data there ever is somewhere out there on the internet, even in an always online world. There are things about these old ways, these old literacies, these ways of learning that involve participation, that involve the body, that involve kinesthetic learning, and learning how to do things because that was right. And I know even before I turned to run, that one was right. Those old ways have things to teach us, which I believe that we have in many cases lost. And not only to teach us, but to teach our communities. Because I think that these ways of learning enhance communities. They make it necessary. They depend upon communication. You have to talk to someone to learn these things. You have to be willing to listen to someone in order to impart these things. So I believe that these old ways, this homeland of the mind, this way of learning and teaching, of demonstration, imitation, critique, this vernacular tradition can do things for us that can repair not only our own hearts, our own minds, but also our own communities. And in the 21st century, we need it. Thank you.